She ran warm water over the stuck ice tray, not knowing the trick would outlast the house itself. What did 1960s women know that we forgot? Nancy. This is the part nobody puts on a nostalgia poster. The post-war homemaker was not lazy, and she was not a martyr either. She was running a small operation with a stove, a sink, and a clock, and she figured out shortcuts the same way any good manager does, by trial, by her mother's hand on her shoulder, and by a magazine column she trusted more than she trusted the ads around it. Every one of these 30 tricks came from somewhere real. Home economics extension offices sent county agents door-to-door teaching efficient kitchen layout. Ladies' Home Journal and Good Housekeeping ran tested tip columns every month, checked in real test kitchens before they ever reached print. This was not folklore passed around a card table. It was closer to quiet, unglamorous engineering done by women whose names never made the byline. Trick number 1 is not a recipe at all. It is a layout. The sink, the stove, and the refrigerator formed what home economists called the work triangle, worked out by researchers at the University of Illinois in the late 1940s and taught everywhere by the 1960s. Keep those 3 points close, and every meal takes fewer steps to make. It sounds obvious now because it worked so well it simply became how kitchens are built. Before she ever turned on a burner, a careful cook laid everything out first. Muffin tins and small juice glasses became her measuring stations, every ingredient portioned and waiting in its own little cup. French cooks called it mise en place, but Nancy's grandmother just called it getting ready. Julia Child would bring the phrase to American television screens in 1963, but home economics teachers had been drilling the same habit into farm kitchens for decades already. Betty Crocker was not one woman. She was a name General Mills invented in 1921 and gave to a rotating staff of real home economists working in a real test kitchen. By the 1960s, surveys of the era found her name recognized by nearly as many Americans as the First Ladies. Every trick published under that name had actually been tested, timed, and rewritten until an ordinary cook could not fail at it. One bowl, one mix, and biscuits went from a 20-minute production to 5. Biscuit had been on shelves since 1931, but it was the post-war decades that turned it into a kitchen staple because it let a tired woman get something warm on the table without measuring flour, salt, and shortening from scratch every single time. Your grandmother knew something they stopped teaching, and half of it was simply knowing which shortcuts were worth taking. Long before the slow cooker, there was the electric skillet, and by the mid-1950s it sat on nearly every wedding registry in America. Plug it in on the counter, brown the meat, add the vegetables, set the thermostat low, and walk away to fold laundry or answer the phone. It freed a woman from standing over the stove, which is the entire point of every trick on this list. Time she got back, she spent somewhere else that mattered. A pot roast that took 3 hours in the oven could come out of a pressure cooker in under 1, and dried beans that needed an overnight soak were tender in minutes. It was one of the single biggest time savers in the whole decade. It is also worth saying plainly, those older pressure cookers lacked the safety interlocks modern ones have, and by the mid-1970s, reports of lid failures led to recalls and a sharp decline in home use. Today's pressure cookers are built entirely differently. Corningware came out in 1958, and it genuinely changed how a woman planned a week of meals because for the first time, a dish could go from the freezer straight into a hot oven without cracking. That meant Sunday's extra casserole could be frozen solid and reheated on Wednesday in the very same dish it was baked in. Fewer pots, fewer pans, fewer trips to the sink. It disappeared from most store shelves eventually, but plenty of it is still in daughters' cupboards today. Brownie Wise, a single mother out of Detroit, built an entire sales system around a rubber seal lid starting in 1951, and by the 1960s, the Tupperware party was a fixture of suburban life. It was pitched as food storage, but it was really a time trick in disguise. One sealed container meant fewer spoiled leftovers, fewer emergency grocery runs, and one social afternoon that replaced a dozen separate errands. Wise became one of the highest paid female executives in the country doing it. Before plastic wrap earned its place, waxed paper did the job, and it did it cheaper. Cake pans got lined with it so nothing stuck, and cleanup took half the time. Sandwiches got wrapped in it for school lunches, and in some households the same sheet got smoothed out and reused more than once. Saran wrap had reached stores by 1953, but in a budget-conscious kitchen, wax paper held on for years after, simply because it worked and it cost less. Aluminum foil hit the consumer market in 1947, and within a decade it had quietly rewritten how a roasting pan got cleaned. Wrap the chicken, wrap the potatoes, line the pan itself, and the burnt-on mess that used to mean 20 minutes of scrubbing simply got lifted out and thrown away. It sounds small. It was not small. Ask any woman who spent her evening scraping a broiler pan by hand what a sheet of foil was actually worth to her. If you picture a 1960s kitchen morning, picture the percolator, not a drip machine, because that automatic drip pot most of us grew up with did not really take over until Mr. Coffee arrived in 1972. Through the 60s, a woman set the percolator on the stove, timed it by ear as much as by clock, and had coffee ready the moment breakfast plates hit the table. The trick was knowing the sound it made right before it was done. A can of cream of mushroom soup was not just soup, it was a sauce base, and once a woman understood that, half her weeknight cooking got faster. The green bean casserole built on that idea dates back to 1955, and it stuck around for decades because it solved a real problem, a creamy binding sauce in 90 seconds instead of 40 minutes at the stove whisking a roux. It is easy to laugh at now. It is harder to argue it did not work. There is a story food historians tell often about the early cake mixes. The first versions only needed water added, and sales were flat. The story goes that when manufacturers changed the formula so the cook had to crack in a fresh egg herself, sales climbed because it gave her something that felt like her own contribution instead of just following instructions. Whether that theory is the whole truth or not, it says something true about what these women actually wanted: credit for the work. In 1960, a copywriter named Peg Bracken published a cookbook with a title that made women laugh out loud in the grocery aisle, the I Hate to Cook book. It sold in the millions over the following years because it finally said out loud what a lot of homemakers felt but were not supposed to admit, that cooking 3 meals a day for a family was exhausting and there was no shame in wanting it faster. Her shortcuts were not lazy. They were honest. Here is the part nobody expects. Time-use researchers who studied diaries from 1965 found the average full-time homemaker was still logging around 55 hours of housework a week. New appliances made individual tasks faster, but the overall week did not necessarily get shorter because standards rose right alongside the tools: more frequent laundering, bigger homes, more errands. The kitchen tricks were real and they helped. They were not a magic fix for the whole week's workload, and Nancy already knows that. By 1960, refrigerators and ranges had become nearly universal in American homes, part of the reason so many of these tricks could spread so fast. A tip printed in a magazine in Ohio worked exactly the same in a kitchen in Georgia, because the equipment underneath it had finally become standard. That uniformity is easy to take for granted now, but it is what let a shortcut travel from one woman's kitchen to a million others in the space of a single issue. It surprises people to hear that in 1960, a built-in dishwasher was still the exception, not the rule, in most American kitchens. That is exactly why so many of these tricks exist: foil liners to skip scrubbing, sealed containers to avoid extra washing, one-pot meals that meant one pot to clean instead of 4. Every shortcut on this list is really answering the same quiet question: how do I get this done with my own 2 hands and still have an evening left over? A standalone chest freezer in the basement or the back porch let a woman cook once and eat twice, sometimes 3 times. Double a casserole on Sunday, freeze the second half solid, and Wednesday's dinner was already done before Wednesday started. Magazine columns of the era called it cooking ahead, and it was especially common in rural households where a long drive to the grocery store made planning several meals at once simply practical. It is the same instinct behind meal prep today, just with a different name. Instant pudding arrived in 1959, and by the early 60s it had become one of the fastest desserts a woman could put in front of a family. Milk stirred in, 5 minutes on the counter, and it was set enough to serve. It filled the same role a homemade custard once did, at a fraction of the standing time. Whether it counted as a real dessert was debated at some dinner tables. Whether it saved time was never in question. That trick from the very beginning of this video was not just about getting ice out faster. Those old metal trays had a lever that could bend if you forced it, and a bent lever meant a ruined tray and a trip to buy another one. A few seconds of warm water saved the tray itself. It is a small thing, but it is the kind of small thing that added up across a whole kitchen full of tools meant to last. Julia Childs. The French chef went on the air in February of 1963. And one thing she repeated constantly was having every single thing ready before the burner ever turned on. It was not a new idea. Home economics teachers had been drilling it for years, but seeing it demonstrated on a television screen in real time made it click for millions of women who had never called it anything but common sense. Preparation was the trick behind almost every other trick on this list. A lot of these tricks were really about turning cooking into a small assembly line instead of one long, unbroken task. Chop everything first, brown the meat while the vegetables wait, layer the casserole, then freeze half before it ever goes in the oven. Breaking the work into stages meant a woman could stop and start around a ringing telephone or a crying child without losing her place. It is the same principle behind a factory line, just scaled down to fit one kitchen counter. Almost every kitchen kept a coffee can by the stove for bacon grease, strained through a bit of cheesecloth or a mesh strainer, and saved for the next time something needed frying. It meant less butter and shortening bought at the store, and cooks swore the flavor it added to cornbread or fried potatoes could not be replicated any other way. It was frugality first, but the taste it left behind is a large part of why people still talk about this era's food the way they do. A cast-iron skillet in a 1960s kitchen was rarely new. It had usually been handed down, wiped clean with a rag and a little oil rather than scrubbed with soap, because soap was believed to strip the seasoning a pan had built up over years. That seasoned surface meant food released easily without sticking, no matter how many decades the pan had been in the family. The kitchen remembers, even when we forget, and a well-cared-for cast-iron pan remembers longest of all. The one-dish supper was less a recipe than a philosophy. Meat, starch, and vegetable, all cooked together in a single casserole dish, meant one thing went in the oven, and one thing came out to the table, and only one dish needed washing afterward. It fed a family for less money than a meat and 3 separate sides, and it used the oven's heat efficiently instead of running 2 burners and an oven all at once. It was practical cooking dressed up as a Sunday centerpiece. Long before anyone called it meal planning, a woman sat down on Sunday with a notepad and mapped out the entire week's dinners against what was on sale at the market and what was already sitting in the pantry. It meant one grocery trip instead of 5, and it meant almost nothing went to waste because every ingredient already had a job to do before it ever came in the door. It was budgeting and cooking solved in the same 15 minutes at the kitchen table. Some kitchens kept what was sometimes called a scrap pot in the refrigerator, a container where small leftover bits of vegetables, meat trimmings, and bones went through the week, destined to become soup stock on Saturday. Nothing purchased went to waste, and by the end of the week, a woman had a rich, deeply flavored stock built almost entirely from what would have otherwise been thrown away. It disappeared from most modern habits, but it still works exactly as well today as it did then. A single nested set of metal measuring cups, hung on a small hook right beside the stove, meant a cook never had to hunt through a drawer mid-recipe. It sounds almost too simple to count as a trick, but home economics teaching manuals of the era specifically called out tool placement as a real-time factor because every extra step across the kitchen was a few more seconds multiplied by every single meal, every single day for years. Good Housekeeping ran its own testing institute, a real laboratory where staff actually cooked every recipe and tried every appliance before it earned the magazine's seal of approval. That seal meant something to a shopper standing in a hardware store deciding between two electric skillets. It was one of the earliest examples of a media brand doing independent product testing purely to protect its readers' time and money, decades before anyone used the word Consumer Reports as a household name. A packet of dry onion soup mix stirred into sour cream became the standard party dip of the decade, ready in under a minute, with no chopping, no sautéing, nothing standing over a pan. It shows up in nearly every community cookbook printed by churches and women's clubs across the country in the 1960s, which tells you how completely it took over. It was not fancy. It got a woman out of the kitchen and into her own party, which was the entire point. A pie crust used to demand cold butter cut in by hand and a light touch that took years to learn. By the 1960s, pre-made crusts and simplified oil-based recipes let a less experienced cook get a respectable crust on the table without the years of practice her mother had needed. Purists grumbled, and plenty of women still made crust from scratch out of pride, but the shortcut existed for anyone who needed a pie for a potluck by 4 o'clock and did not have the morning to spare. Powdered iced tea mix and drink concentrates meant a pitcher of something cold could be ready in the time it took to stir. No steeping, no waiting for a kettle to boil and cool again in the middle of a hot afternoon. For a woman managing children home from school in summer, that was not a small convenience. It was the difference between a calm kitchen and a chaotic one. Small tricks like this rarely make history books, but they shaped an ordinary afternoon more than most. Put a few of these side by side and the math becomes obvious. A scratch biscuit took about 20 minutes from raw flour and shortening. The one bowl version took closer to 5. A stovetop pot roast took 3 hours. The pressure cooker version took under 1. A hand-whisked cream sauce took 40 minutes to get right. A canned soup base took 90 seconds. None of these shortcuts were laziness. Everyone bought back real minutes in a day with a fixed number of them. Some households copied the frozen TV dinner tray idea for their own leftovers, dividing a plate into sections so a child's dinner could be portioned, covered, and reheated later without every item touching and going soggy together. Swanson had introduced the original TV dinner back in 1953, and by the 60s, the divided plate idea had jumped from the freezer aisle into ordinary kitchen habits, proof that a good trick spreads regardless of where it started. A simple wooden clothespin sealed a half-used bag of flour or sugar just as well as anything sold for the purpose, and it lived right in the kitchen drawer instead of the laundry basket. This is the kind of trick that never got written down in any magazine because it did not need to be. It passed from a mother's hands to a daughter's without a single word of explanation required. The recipe was never written down, but every woman knew it by heart. Stale bread never went in the trash. The heels and dried-out slices became breadcrumbs, rolled fine with a rolling pin between 2 sheets of waxed paper, then stored in a jar for the next meatloaf or fried chicken coating. It meant one less trip to the store for something already sitting on the counter going hard, and it meant almost nothing purchased ever truly went to waste in a kitchen run by a woman who had likely grown up during rationing. Something as simple as keeping a lid on a pot while water heated cut the time to a boil noticeably. And home economics columns of the era actually printed this as a specific numbered tip, because plenty of cooks genuinely did not realize how much heat escaped from an uncovered pot. It is the kind of trick that feels almost too obvious to mention today, which is exactly why it is worth mentioning, because obvious only became obvious after someone bothered to teach it. Late summer meant canning, and a woman with a good pressure canner and a stocked pantry of jars was not just saving money, she was buying herself entire winter dinners in a single August weekend. Rows of tomatoes, green beans, and peach preserves lined a cellar shelf. And every one of those jars meant a dinner in February that required no trip to a snow-covered grocery store and almost no prep beyond opening the lid. It disappeared from most kitchens, but it still works. Cookie dough got the same freezer treatment as casseroles. Roll it into a log, wrap it in waxed paper, and slice off only what was needed for that day's batch, baking 4 cookies or 40, depending on who was coming over. It meant fresh-baked cookies were never more than 20 minutes away without ever mixing a bowl of dough from scratch on a random Tuesday afternoon. It is a trick plenty of home bakers still use today without knowing exactly where it came from. A recipe calling for room temperature eggs used to mean setting them out an hour ahead, but a quick trick solved that too. A few minutes in a bowl of warm tap water brought cold eggs up to baking temperature in a fraction of the time. Room temperature eggs blend more evenly into batter, and this small shortcut meant a woman did not have to plan her baking an hour in advance just because the refrigerator had done its job too well. Powdered milk lived in a lot of pantries specifically for baking, since a recipe that only needed a small amount of milk did not require opening and later wasting a full, fresh carton. Mixed only as needed, it meant less spoilage and fewer trips to the store for something used in small amounts. It was frugality wearing the disguise of convenience, which describes a large share of the tricks on this list once you look closely enough at why they actually existed. Before a single dish was scrubbed, a wise cook filled the sink with hot soapy water and let pots and pans sit while the family ate dinner. By the time dessert was finished, baked-on food had already loosened on its own, and what would have been 10 minutes of hard scrubbing became 2 minutes of an easy wipe. It was patience disguised as a trick, letting time and hot water do work that arms and elbow grease used to have to do alone. A stand mixer or hand mixer took over the arm work that used to define baking day, and a cake batter that once took 10 minutes of hand beating to get properly light and smooth took barely 2 minutes with a motor doing the work. It seems like an obvious upgrade now, but it fundamentally changed how often a woman felt she could reasonably bake something from scratch during a busy week, because the physical toll of doing it by hand had simply been removed. A strip of masking tape and a grease pencil turned a chaotic freezer into an organized pantry, every foil package labeled with its contents and the date it went in. Without it, a frozen lump wrapped in foil was a mystery until it thawed, which wasted both the food and the evening. Dating each package also meant nothing sat forgotten for a year, quietly losing flavor in the back corner behind everything else, which every home economics column of the era warned specifically against. In some towns, several families split the cost of a side of beef and a chest freezer's worth of storage, buying in bulk at a lower price per pound than any grocery store offered one family at a time. It meant real savings, but it also meant real trust between neighbors, since everyone relied on the same freezer and the same honest division of the meat. It is a reminder that plenty of these tricks were not solved alone. They were solved together, over a fence. It sounds almost too small to mention, but a pot holder hung on a hook directly beside the oven door, instead of tucked away in a drawer across the kitchen, saved a woman from ever having to set down a hot dish while she searched for one. Home economics efficiency studies of the era actually measured steps like this, literally timing how many seconds and how many footsteps a poorly placed tool cost across a single meal, multiplied by every meal in a year. Gravy did not require a separate pan or a special trip to the store. It came straight from whatever fat and browned bits were already left behind in the roasting pan. A little flour whisked in, a splash of the pan drippings, and dinner had a sauce that used ingredients already paid for and already dirtying a pan that needed washing anyway. It is the kind of trick built entirely on using what you already have in front of you, rather than reaching for something new. A sharp knife is faster than a dull one in a way that is easy to forget until you have used both, and a quick pass on a sharpening steel before dinner prep meant vegetables were chopped in a third of the time with far less risk of a slip. Many kitchens kept the steel hanging right next to the cutting board specifically so sharpening became a habit done without thinking, not a chore that got postponed until the knife barely cut at all. There is a quiet history hiding behind almost every trick on this list. The county home demonstration agents, mostly women themselves, who traveled from town to town through the 1950s and 60s, teaching exactly this kind of efficient, budget-minded cooking. They rarely appear in the popular memory of the era the way advertising icons do, but they were the ones standing in real kitchens, teaching real women, one afternoon at a time. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save. Plenty of women baking in the 1960s had grown up during wartime rationing, and habits formed under real scarcity did not disappear just because sugar and butter became easy to buy again. Recipes that stretched a small amount of sugar further or substituted oil for butter when butter was scarce stuck around in family recipe boxes for years after the actual shortage ended, simply because they had been proven to work and nobody saw a reason to fix what was not broken. Air drying dishes on a wire rack instead of hand toweling every single plate saved real minutes at the end of a meal. Minutes that added up across 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. It seems like the smallest trick on this list, and that is exactly the point of this video. Most of what saved these women hours was not one dramatic invention. It was dozens of small decisions like this one, repeated so often they stopped feeling like decisions. Local radio stations across the country ran short daytime cooking segments throughout the 1950s and 60s, often sponsored by a flour company or a dairy co-op, giving a woman a new recipe or a quick tip while she worked at the stove with the radio on the counter beside her. It meant she did not have to seek out advice. It came to her while her hands were already busy, which is probably the single most efficient way any of these tricks could have ever reached her. Home delivery was still common in parts of the country through the early 1960s. A milkman leaving bottles on the porch before sunrise, sometimes a bread delivery route doing the same. It meant a woman's weekly planning did not depend entirely on her own trip to the store. Some staples simply arrived on a schedule she could build the rest of her meals around. It is easy to forget how much of this era's efficiency came from systems built around the home, not just tricks performed inside it. A simple kitchen timer, the kind with a twist dial and a loud mechanical bell, let a woman step away from the stove entirely and trust that she would hear it the moment something needed attention. Before reliable timers became common and inexpensive, cooks had to hover, checking constantly out of worry rather than necessity. That bell bought back entire stretches of a woman's afternoon, time she could spend anywhere else in the house, while dinner quietly took care of itself. Oven cleaning used to be one of the most dreaded chores in the whole house, and plenty of women developed their own methods to make it less punishing, often simply lining the oven floor with foil to catch drips before they ever baked onto the metal. It is worth saying plainly that some era cleaning methods involving strong chemicals were later found to be harmful and are not something to recreate today. The foil trick, though, is still standard advice from any modern appliance manufacturer. Church cookbooks and women's club recipe collections, typed up and mimeographed and bound with a plastic comb, are one of the most overlooked archives of this entire era. They were not written by professional chefs chasing a book deal. They were written by neighbors, sharing exactly the trick that made their Tuesday night easier, printed and sold to raise money for a new roof or a school trip. Somewhere in a box in an attic, one of these might still exist with your own grandmother's handwriting in the margin. It is worth pausing on how much quality control actually went into these tricks before they ever reached a reader. A tip submitted to a magazine's test kitchen was not printed on faith. It was cooked, timed, and often cooked again by a different staff member to confirm it actually worked the way the original letter claimed. That is a level of rigor easy to underestimate today when a tip can spread online in minutes with nobody checking it at all. Sifting flour by hand through a mesh sifter used to be considered essential for a light cake until many bakers realized whisking pre-sifted flour briefly with a fork accomplished nearly the same result in a fraction of the time. It was a small rebellion against an instruction nobody had ever questioned, and it shows up in tip columns of the era specifically because someone finally tested whether the old rule actually mattered as much as everyone assumed it did. Keeping a damp cloth draped over the cutting board edge meant it would not slide while chopping, a habit taught almost universally by home economics programs, because a slipping cutting board was one of the most common causes of kitchen injury. It is a trick that has nothing to do with speed on its own, but a kitchen without an accident in it is a kitchen that keeps moving instead of stopping for a bandage and a worried phone call. The inside wrapper of a stick of butter was never thrown away right after unwrapping. It got tucked in a small dish in the refrigerator door and reused to grease a pan the next time one was needed. It meant a woman was not reaching for a fresh stick and a knife every single time a recipe called for a greased pan, squeezing one more small use out of something that would otherwise have gone straight into the trash. It is worth saying plainly why any of this still matters on a Tuesday night in 2026. Grocery prices have climbed enough in recent years that stretching a meal, freezing ahead, and using every part of an ingredient are not nostalgic ideas anymore. They are practical ones again. The tricks did not stop working when the decade ended. They simply stopped being necessary for a while, and now plenty of families are quietly rediscovering exactly why their grandmothers bothered with them in the first place. Estate sales today are still full of Pyrex bowls, Corningware casseroles, and cast iron skillets that collectors specifically seek out, not for decoration, but because the pieces genuinely outperform a lot of what is sold new. That says something important about this whole video. These were not quaint relics of a simpler time. Plenty of them were simply well-made, well-designed tools that solved a real problem, and they have outlasted the decades exactly the way their owners hoped they would. It is fair to hold two things at once here, the way Nancy usually does. This decade sold women more processed convenience than any before it, canned soups and boxed mixes marketed hard as liberation. And in the very same decade, the scratch tricks in this video, the cast iron seasoning, the scrap pot stock, the Sunday meal plan, kept quietly surviving underneath all that marketing, passed hand to hand because they actually worked. Both things were true in the same kitchen, often on the same afternoon. Some kitchens of the era were built with a small fold-down ironing board tucked into a cabinet, letting a woman iron a shirt collar while keeping an eye on something simmering on the stove 2 steps away. It is a small architectural detail that says everything about how these kitchens were designed, not as a single-purpose room, but as the true control center of the entire household, built to let one set of hands manage several jobs without ever really leaving the room. Sandwiches for a week of school lunches sometimes got made and frozen in batches on a Sunday afternoon, wrapped individually in waxed paper, and pulled out one at a time each morning, thawed by lunchtime in a paper sack. It meant 4 or 5 fewer sandwich-making mornings in a single week, and it is a trick that still surprises people today, because most assume freezing a sandwich would ruin it, when in practice, with the right fillings, it held up perfectly well. Nesting mixing bowls and stacking pots by size inside one another, instead of spreading them across a cabinet, meant a woman could grab the exact size she needed in a single motion, rather than pulling out three to find the right one. It is a habit that shows up in nearly every kitchen organization tip from the era, because cabinet space was often small and a family's cookware had usually grown over years of wedding gifts and hand-me-downs from an aunt or a mother. Instead of rinsing vegetables one at a time under a trickling faucet, many cooks filled a large basin or the sink itself and washed a whole week's worth of produce in one batch, draining and drying it all together before it went into the refrigerator crisper. It turned a task that could have been repeated 5 separate times across a week into one 15-minute job done once, on the same day the groceries came in from the car. A surprising amount of this knowledge traveled over a backyard fence rather than through any printed page. Neighbors traded tricks the way they traded tomatoes from the garden, a quick exchange over the clothesline about keeping a roast from drying out, or how long to let dough rise in a cold kitchen. It was an informal network long before anyone had a word for that, and it moved just as fast as any magazine column, sometimes faster, because it came with a face attached to it. A small spice rack mounted on the inside of a cabinet door, jars arranged alphabetically or by how often they were reached for, meant a recipe never stalled out while a woman searched for the cinnamon behind 6 other jars. It is a tiny piece of organization, but home economics efficiency studies of the era counted exactly this kind of searching as wasted motion, and wasted motion, multiplied across a lifetime of dinners, was time that could never be gotten back. None of these 30 tricks were about being a perfect homemaker, and it does the women who use them a disservice to frame it that way. They were about a woman with a fixed number of hours in her day, making sharp, practical decisions, so she had something left over for herself by the time the dishes were done. That is not a quaint historical footnote. It is a genuinely impressive form of quiet expertise, and it deserves to be remembered as exactly that. The kitchen remembers, even when we forget. And every one of these 30 tricks came from a real woman solving a real problem with what she had in front of her. If one of these reminded you of your own mother or grandmother standing at her stove, tell me about her in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want more of this forgotten world uncovered week after week, stay close. There is so much more still waiting to be found.